should not just want to get votes and recognition to do that.
Mr. Michael Tian. Mr. President, we have had ample discussion in the community on the issue of legislating on standard working hours, and the employers and the labor sector are in constant struggle. I recall in the beginning of this term, we also had a similar motion on standard working hours. I agree that for low-income workers, overtime work is a common phenomenon. I agree that there should be standard working hours to protect them, but I do not agree to the broad brush approach as proposed in some amendments. In recent years, I understand in the community there are two main points in discussing standard working hours. Economic asymmetry. Some have to do with justice, the other side have to do with maintaining work-life balance. I asked Secretary many times the purpose of legislating on standard working hours. Then SWHC's survey says that the objective of standard working hours is to allow more workers to achieve work-life balance. So if this is the objective, you should set, instead of standard working hours, maximum working hours, because standard working hours only seek to ensure paid overtime work. It has nothing to do with ensuring maximum number of working hours. The original motion and most of the amendments have to do with setting standard working hours. I think standardizing working hours across the board for all sectors is problematic. I have great reservations. So far, there hasn't been any consensus. First of all, for different sectors, different jobs, it is impossible to set the standard working hours for them. Let's look at the UK for public transport workers. They come from the aviation, land transport, and maritime industries, and they have different working hours. What about Hong Kong? Should we use the per month, per week, or per day as the basis of calculation? How can we reach a consensus across the sectors? Some SMEs have told me that the per month approach would be the most appropriate because this would give some flexibility. Some sectors, on the other hand, have told me because of the seasonal factor, it should be calculated on a quarterly basis. And in some other countries, they use the basis of 17 weeks, and that's the case in the United Kingdom. And some could use the 54 weeks as the basis, and in EU the basis of calculation is 4 months. So which standard should we follow? And on calculation of working hours, we have had a lot of discussions on that. What about standby time for disciplined services and healthcare staff? What about traveling time? Let's say if we reply to an email when we are on the road, then should it be counted to be on the clock? What about if we are abroad, if we sit down and just type something on the computer or write down something, would they be counted as work? And in Western countries like France, US, Europe, and Singapore, for managerial staff or supervisors, exemptions are given. So how can a company draw a line in their staff structure? Who should be regarded as superiors or managers? Is it that one is a superior as long as one has a subordinate? Then exemptions could cover many people. And there are also the opt-out option for some enterprises. So what's the point of enacting legislation if we offer opt-outs? So for those listening to this debate, we should consider very carefully. Can we really reach a consensus on these 4 points? How many more years is it going to take? It's more difficult than a constitutional reform package for the CE election by universal suffrage that is not against the basic law. Well, I think that we should not drag things on because over time, workers will continue to be exploited. According to the thematic study, 94% of the employees support standard working hours or contract working hours, and that the working hours should be stipulated in the contract, as well as the overtime arrangement and the mode of compensation for overtime pay. And 82% of employers also support the same idea. So for the remaining 10%, are we going to cater for their needs and legislate on standard working hours for their sake? Finally, I'd like to turn to another point. In 2012, 2013, 2014, I talked about standard working hours. I propose regulating working hours by contract to avoid further deterioration in labor relations, so that there could be harmony between employers and employees. Can you say that work-life balance cannot be maintained by contract working hours? My answer is no. If we have legislation on standard working hours, then for superiors, for those superiors who ask employees to work overtime 10 minutes before they are about to knock off, instead of having this harmony, the company will have to pay the employees for their overtime work, and this would cause increase in the operational costs of companies, and consequently, companies will need to resort to automated workflow instead of paying for overtime work. I think this is the best way to address the issue of imbalance. Mr. Paul Chair.
如果要了解到呢個問題嘅複雜性呢，我諗要
To understand the complexity of the issue, we must first understand the human beings. If we want standard working hours in Hong Kong, if we want employees to have a better quality of life, we should start with students. Because if we don't even have a so-called standard working hours when we are students, then this problem will just pass on like a DNA inheritance. Well, starting from a small age, students would only focus on competition, on academic results, and they study over time. They attend tuition classes, extracurricular activities. They do everything over time. If this mindset doesn't change, then standard working hours will be nothing but something that exists in name. It will be beneficial for those who are sloppy at the work, but it doesn't help the can-do spirit in Hong Kong.
唔同嘅背景嘅人士，譬如啲潮州人啦。
For those coming from different backgrounds, those with Chiu Chow or Fu Chow origin, these are hardworking people. So unless you So unless you're suggesting that working overtime would lead to imprisonment or fine, this won't help. Or that unless you're saying that an injunction order can be imposed for people working overtime, it won't do much. If you want to legislate on standard working hours for regulating overtime pay, you can improve workers' income, but you cannot improve the workers' family life, nor can you improve sex life as suggested by Mr. Ray Chan, because Hong Kong is a hard-working society. this mechanical piece of legislation would not help. We need to look at our DNA. We need to look at our history. We need to look at the reasons of Hong Kong's success. This is unique in Hong Kong. We have the basic law. In Article 11, it states clearly that Hong Kong will stay a capitalist society for the next 50 years. And we're talking about preserving the way of life in a capitalist society. And freedom is one of the core values in a capitalist society. Many members in this council are very concerned about freedom and human rights. They want to protect human rights, but when it comes to that, it seems that many would forget that the long-standing cornerstone in Hong Kong, apart from human rights, has been freedom. So I think there should be in-depth discussion when it comes to standard working hours. So we should understand the differences between societies. We should not compare ourselves to Western countries, to Singapore, as other members did just now. We must bear in mind that for countries with this kind of legislation, the black market would emerge. For places with standard working hours, they have a huge black market, labor market. In Australia, recently we heard that there are initiatives like apprenticeship for young students, and it is in effect a black labor market exploiting young students. In the U.S., they have long had the standard working hours with overtime pay of 1.5 times the usual pay. But it cannot improve the labor market if we don't do anything to. If we don't address the characteristics of our culture, that is the hard-working spirit, if we do not face up to our blood, to the DNA in our blood, some unnatural things would happen. Well, the situation in Hong Kong is still quite stable, so we haven't seen the impact on SMW yet. And yet, at the same time, there are elderly people who can no longer find jobs for and also for some hard labor work they cannot recruit workers like washers. So there may be disadvantages or problems with such a piece of legislation, which could emerge very soon. So, in short, Mr. Deputy, if we are to legislate on standard working hours, this will undermine freedom and competitiveness in Hong Kong. This will take away the freedom of choice in Hong Kong. We should not haste or rush things through. As for health, well, Hong Kong people enjoy longevity, and as for our quality of living, I don't see a lot of grievances. They should have the freedom to choose how they work and how they live, and we do enjoy this freedom. So we need to be careful about this idea.
Dr. Kenneth Chan, thank you, Mr. Deputy. Well, it's strange that today we have many doomsayers in this council, and that is if C.Y. Leung's government protects the labor by introducing standard working hours legislation, Hong Kong would explode. Our economy would slide down the slope our competitive edge disappeared. Businesses will be bankrupted, and employers would be degraded as employees. And it's also said that this is against the basic law. It violates economic freedom. We would be doing things against capitalist system, and we'll be embracing socialism. What is supposed to be about justice and care and concern for our quality of life, such a positive subject is now distorted into an argument about ideologies. What are you afraid of? Members from functional constituencies who represented the business sector have spoken against standard working hours and the legislation on SWH. Can you elaborate on your observations? Please just don't allow the unfounded arguments to go around unchecked. As for the FTU and people from the pro-establishment camp, what you should ask C.Y. Leung, what he really wants to achieve. He just wants the labor sector to come to the negotiation table, and on the other hand, what he promises is to have studies conducted. So the government has come up with apparently the lies so as to maintain the government coalition. Mr. Chan Yuen-han, this is very problematic. If C.Y. Leung has cheated you, and it looks like that he has done so, and he's going to go against his manifesto. So are you going to tangle with him or whatever? Are you going to delude yourself? It's a very serious matter. If the government has no faith and make promises that it cannot fulfill, we should condemn it. According to Mr. Tommy Chung, he's very resolute in his observations. I would urge the Liberal Party to nominate a candidate, saying that we should not like to have legislation on standard working hours. We are against the minimum wage. Everything should be left to the market. Then there will be competition in the election. Instead of trying to pull strings behind the scene, you should nominate someone with a different platform or manifesto. Otherwise, you are just wasting everyone's time. This subject has been looked into for years, and now we have this committee. And within this term of our council, actually in the first council meeting, the Labour Party's Cheung-kong to move a motion on legislating on standard working hours, and this motion urges the government to introduce a bill on the regulation of working hours within this term, and the content should cover the weekly working hours and also overtime pay. With the split voting system, FC members on one side and GC members on the other, members' motion with no legislative effect, like this one, were all vetoed, and also the amendments were all vetoed. I'm afraid today's motion would suffer the same fate under the split voting system. But it's a very populist move if we pass this motion. Will it affect our life? Mr. Paul Jazz says we enjoy long life in Hong Kong. But living long doesn't mean that you are living well. We are doing everything we can, ignoring our other responsibilities or our families, and we are not seeing our kids for more than 5 minutes a day. And every week we can have a meal with our parents, and then we return to work. And then after you retire at 60, you don't know what to do for the remaining 20 to 30 years. And as Mr. Tommy Cheung has said, yes, you are squeeze everything out of you, and then you can retire, and you have all the time to enjoy. The Civic Party and I myself cannot accept this as a value, as a concept on what values to treasure. The government is saying that we should attract the women to rejoin the work market. We should have family-friendly policies, and so on and so forth. Actually, standard working hours can achieve a good work-life balance, and it's an important pillar to underpin family-friendly policies. If this is not honored as a promise by the government, then the government is no longer qualified to talk about family-friendly policies and work-life balance. You might as well that you have been cheated. We intend not to deprive you of the work-life balance. Dr. Kwok-hung, when we discuss standard working hours, I hope we will not drop to a low level that we are still talking about whether it's needed. Actually, in the report of the committee, there's a UN report quota 101 out of 167 countries have this. And 40% of them would allow not more than 40 hours of work per week. The other 40 to 48 hours. 87 countries have stipulated the overtime pay should be 1.25 the normal rate. And it has been proposed by UN that it should be 44 hours, 40 to 48. And different places should set different overtime pay rates. Is this a new subject? In CY Leung's manifesto, and of course the FTU is aware of this, he said he would work on standard working hours or maximum working hours. But very quickly, he made a smart move. He appointed a standard working hours committee. It's been involved in a mega filibuster. The government invented filibuster. It has a use of 3 years for studies for something that that have been implemented in 101 countries. So it's just a delaying tactic, and for no good reason they propose different things, such as contract working hours. We don't know what this means, and that is there should be a contract between the employer and the employee, and the working hours can be 40, 50, or 60 hours. And what is even stranger, that Mr. Ng Chao Park of FTU stood beside the chairman of the committee while he made the remarks that I've just quoted. And then Chao Park later tried to distance himself by saying that it was just some remarks of his. Maybe he has colluded with the business sector. He has told them that he doesn't care. If this is the case, many employees will be disappointed. It means that you have betrayed the labor sector. Why do we need standard working hours? Our motherland, when the CCP was established, the Communist Internationals advocated the so-called 3 times 8 system. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of sleep. And in an SAR government in a country ruled by the Communist Party, it's really ironic that we are not having standard working hours. We know that there's a medical condition that is death from work fatigue. In Taiwan, there are 100 cases. In Japan, over 10,000 a year. On the mainland, there are tens of thousands or 600,000 such cases. Why protection of labor? Why is protection of labor not something this SAR government should be doing or the CCP should be doing? Long working hours affect families. In government APIs, we have seen messages on family harmony, on care for our children. If you don't have standard working hours, what would happen to grassroots workers? For example, in the hardest hit sectors, the catering trade, or if you work as a security guard, these people have no bargaining power. Overtime work is very serious. The median working hours of the catering trade is 54 hours. We have 728,000 people working more than 51.5 hours in medium working hours terms. Some are working 60 or 70 hours a week. And if we are still not moved by such figures, we are just so careless. And if you work 11 hours, the risk of cardiovascular diseases would go up by 67%. We have been asking people to be more productive and to have more children. What can you do if you cannot really return home in good time and you cannot get protection so that you can take care of your children? How can you encourage families to have more children? And now we have this new idea from the government to draw a line at $15,000 of income. This is really irrational. If you set standard working hours in accordance with pay, this is going to be even more divisive. And the inequality between the different jobs and trades will become more acute. In some places, they set different requirements for different trades. For example, for education workers, medical personnel, and policemen, exemptions are granted. Well, we all know why. Because they are real needs, but they get compensation. What is over and above the standard working hours? They get 1.5 the pay. The government should not do anything that would lead to a wider wealth gap.
Leung Ka-lau. Well, Dr. Kwok mentioned Ng Chao Pak. He is an NPC delegate, don't you know? NPC delegates don't speak. They just walk at the back, and then they just take photos, and that's the end of the story. Ng Chao Pak. He's not a counselor. He's just a tool, a yes man. And there is freedom of speech. Therefore, he rushed to stand in the front. It's just a waste of breath to mention him. Now, when you see great people, you look down upon them. When you see people with great power, you just treat them as ordinary people. If someone has fallen, like Ng Chao Pak, I even blamed Chan Yuen-han. I really doubt his integrity. The FTU should be a labor union he should speak on behalf of the workers. Last term, the FTU supported CY to become 689. About 100 votes among the 689. They were cheated. CY said that after I took office, I would embark on legislation on standard working hours ASAP. Well, if they knew that they had been that would not be done, then the FTU would not support him. What are the merits of standard working hours? Number one, without standard working hours, your boss can ask you to work overtime, and then it may be resisting order. If you put down contracted hours, that is to provide protection. Say you work for 10 hours per day, and if you work for more than 10 hours, that cannot be allowed. Now, CY said that there could not be universal suffrage because those who there is universal suffrage, and those who make less than $14,000 a month would not vote for him. There are many workers who cannot resist to work overtime. If you resist working overtime, then you will be dismissed. Say, for example, I had such an experience in respect of several jobs. I had, say, to attend a meeting, they just dismissed me because I didn't work overtime. Without standard working hours, even if you work overtime, you will not be given overtime pay. When you work on the, you have an 8-hour day, and you work for the 9th hour, the 10th hour, you will become fatigued. You may fall ill as a result. So if you have to work overtime, then you should be paid 1.5 times or 2 times. Yet, without standard working hours, there will be overtime work, but no overtime pay. That's the problem of not having standard working hours. The third is death because of overwork. Even if you sign a contract, you're willing in the future, if you have anything untoward, if you can provide adequate evidence, your boss asks you to work overtime over a long period of time. Even if you have received overtime compensation, you can still make claims. You die because of overwork. You receive overtime pay not to give your life. In my ward office, I receive many complaints. Many workers are overworked. They complain to me, just like a buffalo who tilled the land, who worked for the farmer for several decades. The buffalo was abandoned. Well, there is wear and tear for machines. Same for human beings. These arguments support the necessity of standard working hours. Otherwise, the colleagues who are sitting here will not be given protection. Say, for example, in this council, the colleagues, the staff members have to work overtime many days for many months. And if there is exhaustion, if there is any wear and tear, who is to decline in the health, who is to pay for that if there is no standard working hours? Kwok-hung said that there is filibustering, and therefore the motion debates could not be proceeded with. Hong Kong could not move forward. In fact, he's lying. Comrades, they should not lie. Well, after we pass this motion, will Matthew Cheung implement standard working hours? The FTU has representatives at the SLAB. The LAB stood on the wrong side. Where are your comrades? Now there are many lazy members. Now I do filibustering in order to give you a platform so that you can speak for the workers. You can speak for the Second International, the Third International, how they fight for the interests of the workers. You want workers to be awakened and work together. In fact, the Labor Day, 1st of May, was the result of a strike. Comrade Wong Kwok-hung is hard to understand. Look at this chamber. So many are here. So many people are here. Just 16 people here, Mr. Chairman. I just want to save my breath. I call for a quorum call, and then I'll teach him what is the work of the Second International. Comrade Wong Kwok-hung, please come back. ROP 67X to call people back. In particular, Comrade Wong Kwok-hung is not here. He shouldn't just consume sardines.
Mr.
Leung Kwok-hung, thank you, Mr. President. Without regulation of working hours, workers can't achieve any work at night. This is the case for many people in the evening. Now, for the June 4th vigil night, it will end at 9:30. There was the massacre. Tonight there will be candles to let us remember the cause. So please go to Victoria Park. It will be difficult, but then do obey the voice of your conscience. Quite unlike Wang Kwok-kin, who would just speak without any action. Your time is up. Mr. Martin Liu. In Hong Kong, some workers have overly long working hours. We need to ease the problem. According to the Standard Working Hours Committee appointed by the Chief Executive, there is an initial consensus. They would consider drafting a law so as to specify the contractual working hours and also the method of overtime compensation. A report will be submitted next year. Of course, we cannot preempt what will be recommended, but then it has representatives from various relevant sectors. So I believe that we need to be patient and we should give the committee time to discuss the matter and present a mature, balanced and feasible set of options. Now, it appears that this motion debate is going to preempt the government's work, and unilaterally, we are demanding legislation to regulate standard working hours. I think standard working hours would be too draconian in measure. It will affect our labor market, our business environment, as well as the long-term development of our economy. There will be very far-reaching effects. For Ms. Chan Yuen-han, I can appreciate that she's very anxious about the matter, but still I cannot support her original motion and some of the amendments. According to the government's report of the policy study on standard working hours, in 2010, 80% of the 300,000 employees who don't get compensated for their overtime work are managers and professionals, and they enjoy a higher level of income. They work overtime for different reasons. Say, for example, some of them have contractual requirements to work outside office hours, or they have to complete their task within a deadline. The capability of the employees, their will, and their preferences are also very different. For their take-home pay and the benefits, usually the compensation has already been factored in. For the remaining 20%, they are the low-income workers and the low-skilled workers. Though, in fact, less than 80,000 of them are involved. I think we can enhance the employment ordinance so that we revise the contractual requirements of employees to tackle the problem of overtime work not being compensated. We can then promote labor rights. We can also keep the flexibility so that employers and employees are free to drop their own contracts. This is a good solution. On the other hand, if we are to legislate for standard working hours, it will be the wrong solution for the problem. Hong Kong is a service economy. It is difficult to implement. It will also affect our economic freedom. It will also change our demographic structure in the labor market, and it will affect the allocation of resources. And for SMEs, which are the backbone of our economy, will take the brunt at the forefront. Most economies in the world have introduced standard working hours when industrialization is at its peak. But Hong Kong is already a service economy, and its contribution to our GDP exceeds 90%, and the employees also account for 90% of our labor force. In different sectors, we have got differences in terms of their operational needs and working hours. Some of them have their very special arrangements. For some professional services, sometimes an employee may be required to finish the task within a particular deadline. And then with telecommunication services, employees may be finishing the task at different venues, and it will be difficult to define standard working hours. Moreover, we have had 4 years' experience of statutory minimum wage rates, and we have seen distortions in the labor market. Some of the trades have their wage levels that are far above those requiring candidates with a high educational standard or a higher level of skills, like workers washing dishes. And the businessmen have to resort to different ways to tackle the problem. Moreover, for the standard minimum wage requirements, that would only affect the low-income workers. But then for standard working hours, all the 3 million employees in the labor market will be affected. So the repercussions will be huge. And we can foresee that when we do have standard working hours being stipulated by law, then there will be many changes in the labor market. Maybe there will be more part-time work. And for those of a lower educational standard, of a senior age and with less working experience, they will be the first to be dismissed. And then as a result, the labor cost increase will be shifted to the consumers. Therefore, the standard working hours, if regulated by legislation, will become something that is negative despite the good intentions. I think we need to be mutually accommodating. The Standard Working Hours Committee has adopted an evidence-based approach to study the matter. I think the government should also enhance training and lifelong training so as to enhance efficiency and shorten the working hours. The government should take the lead to provide a family-friendly environment like flexi working hours and promoting the culture of family life-work balance. And we should also introduce additional sources of labor so that we can solve the problem on all fronts. Thank you.
Dr. Fernando Cheung, President. When I was a teacher, I taught evening schools, and the students had a day job. I asked them whether they enjoy their day job, and nobody raised their hand. I asked them how many liked the job they held down. Very few raised their hands. President, today, whether the workers have a sense of commitment and regard the job as one that offers them any meaning, I very few find that their jobs have any meaning, and their jobs are really means to an end. The meaning of jobs has been relegated to a very low position. President, we only have 24 hours a day. We may be sleeping for 8 hours, and we have 16 waking hours. We keep saying that we should have 8 hours work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for us to do things that we need to do. And within the 8 hours, other than the traveling time, the commute, the meals, we have to work, and we have only 1 day of rest in a week. And this is the pattern that we have. This is the routine that we keep. In Hong Kong, it is difficult even to achieve that. According to the administration, 720,000 working people are putting in 54 hours per week. The 8 hours of rest time, the leisure time, not so much the sleeping hours. They don't have a lot of time
a lot of the working hours that are not tied to work is disastrous to human beings. Humanity has achieved improvement. We started off in the agricultural society. Now things are so advanced and so sophisticated, and presumably there should be room for people to pursue something at a higher level. We need to have a family life. We might wish to pursue arts activities. We can pursue many activities, environmental cause, sports, and so on. We can derive meaning from so many different activities, but our work simply deprives us of the opportunity to engage in our pursuits. In our working hours, other than the daily ablution, other than the daily commute, we spend all the time at work. I'm wondering whether this has become a slavery society, or we have degenerated into a situation where it is not the right pattern for human beings. In relation to standard working hours, back in 1999, the ILO started talking about it. They have set certain regulations. Back in 1904, in Australia, they legislated for standard working hours, 40 hours per week. 1930, 44 hours. 1947, 40 hours. About 100 or so countries have legislation in place governing the standard working hours. In this day and age, here in Hong Kong, we're still arguing that Hong Kong is an externally oriented economy. It is highly controversial, and we have to achieve a consensus, and things are terribly complicated. We need to have a free society, a free market. Free market is a free market for the capitalists. Hong Kong prides itself as a free market. I think in the primordial forest, it would be the freest, survival of the fittest. Who's more aggressive, who is the more ferocious, would win. Are we still in the primordial time? Why is it in Hong Kong we still have to keep this primitive model? C.Y. Leung took office, and he said he would look at the legislation regarding standard working hours. The government was thinking about going down the legislative path. The government enjoys powers, the public power. It has all the executive power and all the legislative power. All the powers are in the government's hand. I think the only thing that they don't have now remains the judiciary power. I heard from my colleagues that there is no consensus. The labor costs would be too high. If the employers are not prepared to take up the course, then it would be the workers who are paying all the price. They don't have much of a family life. They don't have much time with their kids. We're paying with our health. We're paying with our life. And this is the primitive law of the jungle kind of capitalist system in Hong Kong. It is a special day in Hong Kong. However meaningless it is in our life, we can do something meaningful tonight. I hope that you will all turn up at Victoria Park after work to attend a candlelight vigil. We want to fight for standard working hours. Thank you. Dr. Helena Wong. President, the Democratic Party is in support of going down the legislative path for the standard working hours. Minimum wage and standard working hours are two terribly important measures. We have been arguing over many years before we could achieve the statutory minimum wage. I think the arguments are similar now as we heard before. The one thing that we haven't done that should be done is the standard working hours. In capitalist societies or socialist countries, we have seen the introduction of legislation on standard working hours. Statistically, the world over, and this is according to the International Labour Organization, 2010, the global profile in 2009 of the 106 countries polled, most of them have already legislated for the standard working hours per week. 40% of the countries have legislation on 40 hours per week. 22% of the countries made standard working hours 48 hours per week. Ms. Chan Yuen-han's original motion urges the government to enact legislation and set the number of hours at 44 per week. This is a moderate approach, and the Democratic Party is in support of this proposal. President, the reason why we need to have legislation on standard working hours is to safeguard the fundamental rights of the workers. They will not be exploited by the employers in order to cut costs, in order to maximize the profits. I think this is one of the important measures to guard against exploitation. Take a company, take a shop, for instance. It may need 10 people to do all the work, but in order to cut corners, they may have a payroll of 6, 7, or 8 who will have to do 10 people's work, and as a result, people will have to put in extra hours, and this is taking a toll on the well-being of the workers, and the number of working hours will be eaten into their daily life, and this is upsetting their work-life balance. In modern-day society, we do have some sort of optimal standard. We have to achieve work-life balance, and this is something that all enterprises and all employers would have uppermost in their mind. They should not be always trying to maximize their profits. Long working hours will deprive workers of any life other than work. They become slaves to their work. In Hong Kong, President, the long working hours is beyond dispute. In 2014, according to a survey, on average, workers are putting in 45.3 hours per week. In most trades and industries, it is more than 50, like security guard, elderly care, property management, and catering. And they are low-income trades. Hong Kong U in 2013 conducted a study that shows that 70% of the people died because of overwork. 32% are putting in 6 days a week. And the respondents said they are under tremendous pressure. 38% of the people polled said that the pressure is 7 out of 10. And the pressure will be continuing in their home life, and this will be taking a toll on their mental and emotional health. I'm sure that that contributed to the high divorce rate and domestic violence and domestic problems, and these are significant contributory factors. President, we are asking for legislating for standard working hours, not because this is a labor welfare issue. We should perceive that as an important element in family-friendly policy. The government said that we have to attach importance to family and family value. We have the family council. Unfortunately, when pursuing the policy, the government is not sufficiently vigorous. There are many policies like flexi hours. The government is merely paying lip service. Paternity leave, 10 weeks. Far short of the 14 weeks that the Democratic Party proposes. The only thing is the paternity leave. I was talking about maternity leave. Paternity leave is only 3 days, whereas the civil servants enjoy 5 days. The government is paying lip service to family life, but they're not committed to it. In the Family Council, has there been any discussion on standard working hours? Back in 2007, I dug up the minutes. There was only one meeting devoted to the legislation for standard working hours. There was in August 2003. In that particular meeting, there was the only meeting that they talked about the standard working hours legislation. During the meeting, most of the speakers spoke from the point of view of the business community. They said that the jobless rate in Hong Kong is low, and this idea would certainly pose problems regarding supply of labor, and they said they have to consider extending the working life and the importation of labor. The competitiveness of SMEs will be undermined. All this is a load of nonsense.
Mr. Albert Chan, President, People's Power supports the enactment of legislation on standard working hours. In fact, this is not a new idea, and it is not a magnanimous measure proposed by a government or any political party. In fact, I think it's a universal value. In fact, if we just look around the world, we can see that there is legislation on standard working hours in all civilized places. And look at places with GDP levels comparable to that of Hong Kong. And you can see that in most of those places, there is legislation on standard working hours. Now, Mr. Matthew John is going to tell us that having such legislation will bring a lot of adverse impact. So he is like C.Y. Leung. He seems to, or he says that he cares for the benefits and welfare of the employees, but in fact, he is only paying lip service to his promises or remarks. So in fact, seems that we are in Hong Kong, we are situations like that in the 18th and the 19th century. But of course, our officials know how to pretend to be benevolent and kind. In 1991, there was legislation in New South Wales. And then as early as in 1919, there was legislation in Spain on standard working hours. 1936, France, legislation on 48 hours a week. And then 1938 in the USA, there was legislation for standard working hours of 40 hours per week. So in some countries, they had such legislation a century ago. So you can see how unkind, how apathetic this SAR government is. So you can make reference to academic studies elsewhere on the adverse impact of long working hours. And I'm sure if get hold of all these reports, then even 10 chambers of the size won't be able to house all such reports. And Caritas has also conducted a study on the adverse impact of long working hours on people's health, on their relationship with their family members. Now, I want to say that for some time worked very long hours. I took up 2 full-time jobs, and for one job, I worked from 8 to 4 p.m. and then that was a restaurant, and then I worked another full-time job from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. That was in a warehouse. I worked for 3 months like that, and I want to say that I was very sleepy, and so I fell asleep when I was driving in the daytime. I was not injured, but then I felt very guilty because the elderly person who was also involved in the collision was so scared that he took some time to recover, and so I decided that I could not take up 2 full-time jobs anymore. At that time, I was trying to earn more money so that I could pay my tuition fees. And during those 3 months, I was like a walking dead. I didn't have time to rest, to sleep, to watch TV, to go out with my friends. I merely worked and worked. And, in Hong Kong, working hours are very long. For those working in the catering sector, they work a few hours, and then say they have a break from, say, 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., and then they start working again till late at night. And so such long working hours affect their health, their social life, and also their relationship with their family members. They don't have time to spend with their family members. So I think we in Hong Kong should be entitled to a human and civilized way of life. There are people who live in subdivided flats. It's extremely noisy, it's extremely crowded, it's extremely hot and stuffy, and then there is light pollution, and people can't sleep well. And then for those living in very busy areas, there are buses creating a lot of noise even late at night. And then if you live under the flight path, even if you live in a decent residential development in Ma-wan, again, you wake up when the plane approaches. So I just think we are only asking for a way of life that human beings should be entitled to. I hope that FTU will not backpedal. FTU members always say that they protect the interests of the workers, but then when they are asked to vote, they always told the government line. And in fact, Ms. Chan Yuen-han has betrayed the interests of workers a number of times. I think it's important that we stand firm, and we must not make a U-turn. Ms. Alice Mack. President, I've raised my hand. Please press the request to speak button. I've already called Ms. Alice Mack's name. Yes, Mr. Wong Ting-kwong, what's the problem? President, in fact, when you asked who else would like to speak, I raised my hand immediately, but I saw Miss Alice Mack's hand first. So please, if you want to speak, you should press the request to speak button. Right, Miss Alice Mack. Mr. President, a total of over 30 members have spoken on this motion. And I think this sheer number shows that this issue is a matter of great concern to society. The FTU is asking the government again to enact legislation on standard working hours. And in fact, when Ms. Chan Yuen-han planned to move the motion, we did ask ourselves whether some members would seize the opportunity to gain political points and to attack the FTU. I want to say that the FTU has all along been firmly in support of legislation on standard working hours. There are some who claim that they genuinely want to help employees, and I hope that they will not just seek to gain political points. They should set aside their bias. We should all work together to fight for the interests of the employees. And I will not dwell on this because I only have a few minutes left. And I want to say that some LegCo members have been asking this question time and again. What is the use of having standard working hours? Now, I find this very puzzling. Some ask why you want OT pay for employees, and they also ask whether the staff want money or whether they want rest time. So I think one thing is obvious, and that is these LegCo members do not know what standard working hours mean. Now, standard working hours represent labor policy. Government stipulates the standard working hours, and if employees working hours exceed the standard working hours, then employers have to provide suitable compensation. So members, please do not ask this question again. Please do not ask whether employees want money or whether they prefer rest time. We want to fight for the interests of employees who are being exploited by their employers. Many employees have to work overtime on a continuous basis without any compensation. Now, some say that this is a place where there is economic freedom. This is a capitalist society. This is a capitalist system. But look at EU countries, South Korea and Singapore. These are capitalist countries, and they have got standard working hours. So I hope that members will not speak in such an ignorant manner in order to appease or please certain people. Now, certain members always take pride on their knowledge. So please understand that in a capitalist system, certain working hours are allowed. But then we do not want employees to be exploited. We want to protect their rights. We want them to have bigger or greater bargaining power. And some say that standard working hours should not be applied or should not be implemented across the board. There should be special arrangements for the catering sector, for the tourism sector, for the IT sector. Now, look at the experience in other countries which have standard working hours. Now, before implementation, there is always thorough consultation, and they have arrangements which can suit the circumstances in society. So please do not use this as a pretext to oppose standard working hours. And Mr. Michael Tian said something which was very laughable. He said that the matter should no longer be delayed. He said that Yes, I understand that. Yes, I understand that we must have legislation on standard working hours as early as possible. And the contractual working hours is not good enough. I think members should understand, or members, perhaps, are you willing to accept this? And that is that the number of 44 working hours and be stipulated in the employment contracts, and that if there is overtime work, then there should be overtime pay, which is 1.5 times the standard pay. I think Mr. Michael Tan is right. We should no longer drag our feet. We must act expeditiously. And some regard standard working hours as a monster. Mr. Chan Kin-po said that the statutory minimum wage had been operating well. I agree with him. Now, before the launching of the statutory minimum wage, many people said that minimum wage was a monster. But then, as Mr. Chen Kin-po has said, the SMW has been operating well. Now, do you know that in Hong Kong, high rentals and not wages are the major threat to Hong Kong's competitiveness. In fact, in this labor market, we have an illness. We have to cure the illness. So it's not the time to argue whether drugs are needed to treat the illness. This is a distorted labor market. We need to have legislation on standard working hours as early as possible. We understand that this is no easy task, but I want to state the FTU's position once again. We are firm, we are adamant, and we want the government to live up to its promise.
Mr. Wong Ting-kwong. Thank you, Mr. President. Enacting legislation on standard working hours has been an aspiration of the labor groups. I understand their core. They fight for the labor rights. It is their responsibility. But let me say this. Enacting legislation on standard working hours when compared with minimum wage, I think it will affect more people and the effect will be even more far-reaching. So please consider the following. In the first half of the former century, just like Chaplin's Modern Times, there was inhumane exploitation of workers. Do we still see such scenes in our world today? No. It's impossible. Therefore, we in Hong Kong practice capitalism regarding demand and supply in the market. I don't think it is good to resort to legislation to regulate. It will be very draconian. Have we reached such a stage that we need to resort to such extremist practices? I think we need further discussion. Let me say this. If we are to legislate for standard working hours, I want to know if the labor sector and the labor groups have ever considered this point. The upward social mobility of our workers. And if someone would like to start a business, young people have been telling me that before you start a business, you need to know how to fold your business. When somebody is successful in setting up a business, then the business will expand and then there will be more responsibilities. But then if you fail, then the difficulty will be aggravated because the owner has to find money to compensate the employees. It will be very difficult for them. I have talked to the grassroots, I've talked to the labor groups. They said that that's fine because we can always turn to the committee for the protection of employees affected by bankruptcies. Well, this isn't quite the case. We have got many businessmen who have got unlimited companies, and then they just take out a business registration certificate, so they're personally liable for the debt or the compensation. We have already got a large number of labor legislation. Well, if we continue with this trend, it means that SMEs will be priced out, they will be squeezed out, and then at the end of the day, we will have monopolies. Because small businessmen are afraid that they are not able to discharge the duties even upon the termination of the business. Must we antagonize the employers and employees in this way? I recall that during my younger days, employers and employees are very close. They had the mentality of sharing the same boat. They felt like being in the same family. But today it is totally different. The two are being polarized. They are hostile to each other. I find it strange. Why don't we advocate the spirit that employers and employees cooperate fully with each other? Now, today, things are very different. To be frank, I think it has a lot to do with the political climate of our society. It breaks my heart because I've seen that labor groups are now moving this motion, and in fact, they have been made use of, and in order to expand one's influence, there are people who would like to ask for more, and then they are trying to outcompete each other by demanding ever more. And such a confrontation, such a conflict has been abused so as to attack the government, so as to attack the chief executive. I think it is something we have inherited from the past, and I don't think we can easily resort to a broad brush approach to solve the problem. The working class and the businessmen should try to coordinate among themselves instead of confronting each other. I don't think we should allow our society to be so divided. I hope that for the motion moved by Chan Yuen-han, I hope everybody can sit down and have a good talk rather than criticizing each other as we have seen. So I speak. Thank you. Does another member wish to speak? Mr. Kwok-kin. Mr. President, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Ting-kwong doesn't need to become so emotional. We fight for the enactment of legislation on standard working hours, but it doesn't mean that there will be hostility between the employers and employees. Employees are simply fighting for their interests. Now, Ms. Alice Mack was very angry, saying that the FTU members have been sort of abused, and others were trying to gain political capital. Now, for 60 years, the FTU have been fighting for the labor's interests. We are getting more and more influential, and so others are jealous of us, and that's why they would like to make use of this opportunity to gain political capital. So it just proves that we are getting stronger and stronger. Now, my assistant has written quite a good speech for me. I think all the arguments have basically been covered in the speech of other colleagues. We are approaching the end of the debate, so I'm not going to read from the script because I don't want to sound tedious or repetitive. I just want to highlight a few points. Standard working hours are not the same as maximum working hours. it seems that some members have mixed up the two concepts. For maximum working hours, you cannot work more than the maximum working hours. For standard working hours, we have got a statutory level of standard working hours. When you work overtime, then you will be compensated. It means that you get paid more for more work you do, and it is fair to the employees. Now we have been told that we want to have standard working hours, we want to have work-life balance. Then we have been asked as to why we are trying to get 1.5 times being the overtime compensation rate. It seems that we are just after the dollar sign. Now we all work in order to get paid. Who doesn't? Now, for us to fight for 1.5 times being the overtime work compensation rate, we are fully justified. It means that employers dare not easily resort to overtime requests, because if it is just the same rate of pay, then employers will easily ask employees to work longer hours. Well, employers are fully aware that employees may not be able to finish the work. Then employers will think that employees should be asked to work longer hours so that he can be spared the need to get more workers. Now, by having 1.5 being the overtime pay rate, we just want to send a signal to the employers so that if there is a shortage of workers at the workplace, then the work cannot be finished, then it means that more workers should be recruited. But of course, occasionally, if overtime is necessitated, I'm sure by paying 1.5 times the standard pay, employees will be willing to cooperate. Now, many people have said that for different sectors and professions, like the catering industry, IT, management, accounting sectors, they are all different from one another. I think this is merely an excuse, because if we try to look around the other cities, many countries have already introduced standard working hours, including advanced economies and free economies. For the standard working hours that they have stipulated, they have got exemptions and they've also got special treatments. Certain trades and professions can be covered by tailor-made provisions without jeopardizing the economy as a whole. So for the business sector to scaremonger us, and if they try to threaten us by saying that with standard working hours there will be no future for the business, I think these arguments do not stand. I think as long as the government is willing to introduce standard working hours, I'm sure the problems can be resolved, and then we can certainly accommodate the unique requirements of different trades and sectors. And then, for the Standard Working Hours Committee's recommendation, saying that the standard working hours should be stipulated in the contracts, but I don't think it is quite feasible. When an employee enters into a contractual agreement with the employer, you have to understand that employees do not have strong bargaining powers. How can you expect the employee to talk to the employer on an equal footing? So at the end of the day, we are simply legitimizing the long working hours. At the same time, I want to say that we are having this opportunity to talk about standard working hours, and that the government has set up the Standard Working Hours Committee. This is all because during the CE election in 2012, FTU forced CY Leung to include standard working hours in his electoral platform and manifesto. It shows that by having elections, it means that when we try to fight for labor interests, it will be much assisted. Therefore, if we can approve the political reform package, then the CE to be elected on the basis of universal suffrage, since has to secure millions of votes, and I'm sure we will be more effective and will have a stronger voice in getting labor rights. And on this occasion, the standard working hours hasn't still been enacted by legislation. This is because among the 1,200 members of the selection committee, the business opposition was so strong that CY had to drag his feet. So I think for the grassroots, for the labor sector, we hope that the political reform package can be endorsed, and then the CE will be elected on the basis of universal suffrage, and it has to be accountable to millions of voters, and then the same won't happen again. Does any other member wish to speak?
Ms. Chan Yuen-han, you may now speak on the amendments. The speaking time limit is 5 minutes. Thank you, President. I thank 30-odd members who spoke in favor and against the motion. And this is a subject that has been controversial for so many years.
And in fact, this issue has been debated in society for at least 2 decades. We have been talking about the importance of 8 hours work, 8 hours sleep, and 8 hours learning or relaxation. And I think the business sector should not be rehearsing the same arguments against standard working hours. Now, there are a total of 5 amendments. I agree with Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan, Mr. Ip Kin-yuen, and Dr. Leung Ka-lau. And I don't think I can agree with Mr. Yiu Si-wing and Ms. N. Chang. Now, I don't know what Ms. N. Chang is trying to say. Now, of course, Ms. Chang is a new colleague to this council, but then the DAB has a long history. She is saying that if we want to give employees more rest, then why should we be giving them OT pay? Now, I want to say this, and that this point has been made by Mr. Wong Kwok-kin, and that is, if a person can make ends meet by working 8 hours, why should he want to work overtime? For example, truck drivers can't make ends meet by just working 8 hours. Now, if they can get reasonable pay, they will not want to work overtime. So if members are really concerned about the well-being of employees, they should try to understand their difficulties, talk to the grassroots, understand the difficulties. Mr. Yiu Si-wing said that various trades and industries should be fully consulted. I want to say that these trades and industries have been consulted very thoroughly for many years. And so I think you should try to understand the conflicts between employers and employees. Please do not just say that there are conflicts and so there should be further consultation. I, of course, understand why members representing the business sector hold such views. And I want to say that I support the amendments put forward by Mr. Lee, Mr. Ip, and Dr. Leung. Now, concerning Mr. Lee's amendment, I think I can, in general, agree with him. And then Dr. Lau said yesterday that for doctors within the HA, they conducted or carried out collective bargaining, and in fact he was involved in the long drawn out lawsuit. And I want to tell the other sectors that they need not worry. We can always learn from the HA's experience or the HA's case. And I want to say that we have to have the framework, and then we can look at individual sectors or trades or industries. For example, Mr. Ip Kin-yuen is of the view that there should be a study on the regulation of teaching hours and so on and so forth. And I think it's right that we have to sort out the details within the broad framework. Now, colleagues, I want to say that this is not a political issue, so we do not need to be in a confrontational stage. Let's all be open-minded and let's all work for the interests of the employees.
Secretary for Labour and Welfare. Mr. President, once again, I would like to thank Ms. Chan Yuen-han for moving the motion, and 5 members who have moved amendments. 30 members have spoken in the debate. From the speech of the members, once again, it shows that all walks of life in Hong Kong are very concerned about this matter. And for those who are in support, they hope that we can work through clearly defined working hours, and by having a higher overtime work pay, then workers can have shorter working hours and can deal with the question of compensation for overtime work. And this can enhance the basic rights and interests of the employers, and then there will be a balance between work and life. On the other hand, for those members who have reservations about enacting legislation on standard working hours, they think that usually it is because of the tight labor supply, and so enterprises do not have sufficient manpower, and also employees have to meet the various operational needs in different sectors and occupations. And therefore, standard working hours by legislative means doesn't help to shorten the working hours. On the other hand, it will reduce the flexibility of labor deployment, increase the operational costs, and undermine our effective competitiveness. Yes, the views are divided, but then the government hasn't dodged the issue. In November 2012, the government published the report of the policy study on standard working hours, and then in accordance with the manifesto of the CE during the election campaign in April 2013, the Standard Working Hours Committee was set up so as to follow up on the report and to make recommendations to the government, including whether there should be an enactment of legislation on standard working hours or some other options. As I have said yesterday in the opening remarks, since its establishment, the committee has been working at full steam and has covered a lot of ground, like completing the extensive public consultation last year, and there was a very in-depth survey on working hours. On the 17th of March this year, the government reported to the manpower panel of the Legislative Council concerning the latest progress of the work of the committee, as well as the major findings of the public consultation exercise and the working hours survey. I would like to talk about a few important points. First of all, according to the consultants, employees generally expressed a wish for legislative enactment for working hours, and they think that they have different bargaining powers, and then the grassroots employees do not have strong bargaining powers. So there should be the enactment of legislation on standard working hours, and legislation would be the only effective means of safeguard. Generally speaking, labor groups would like to have 44 hours being the weekly standard working hours, and then the overtime pay rate should be 1.5 times that of the normal pay rate. And employees should be given the choice and right to choose whether to accept overtime pay. Some organizations have said that the maximum working hours should be set at 50 to 72 hours per week, while employers, generally speaking, are strongly against the one-size-fits-all solution, because there are huge differences among different trades, occupations, and employees of different skill levels. Employers think that by having clear labor contracts, then there will be the mechanism to agree on the arrangements of work hours. Employers are also indicating a preference for voluntary guidelines covering working hours. The committee has asked the consultancy to resort to random sampling to carry out a large-scale household survey. And the findings show that among all the employees, 74% thought that for the preceding 7 days they had appropriate number of working hours. 24% thought that they were having too long hours. And among the latter group, 70% of them indicated that if their income would be reduced as a result of shorter working hours, they didn't want to shorten the hours. Among all the employees, 42% thought that if they were adequately and reasonably compensated, they were willing to take up more overtime work. It shows that income would be a very important factor for consideration. It also shows that among all the employees, 83% have already signed written contracts with the employers, that 61% of the contracts or agreements do not stipulate the method of overtime compensation. Other than that household survey, the consultancy firm also carried out a questionnaire survey among members of professional groups and occupational groups, as well as trade union members and chambers of trade association members. The three surveys indicated that 94% of the employees and between 58% and 87% of the members of professional bodies and occupational groups and 55% of members of labor unions are in favor of stipulating the working hours in contracts and having the arrangements for overtime work and compensation for overtime work stipulated in the contracts. 82% of the employers in the household survey and 38% of the members of the trade associations are also in favor of this direction. It shows that 67% and 76% of the household survey employees and between 44% and 68%, between 44% 68% and between 45% and 76% of the members of the professional groups and occupational groups, and 49% and 34% of the trade union members in favor of having legislation for standard working hours and maximum hours respectively. But then for employers, fewer of them would like to have contracts stipulating the requirements. Employers, in fact, 56% and 43% of the employers would like to have legislation to cover such requirements. 11% and 8% of the trade association members are in favor of such a direction. And having considered the findings of public consultation and the working hours surveys, and we adopt the evidence-based approach, I understand that we need to consider the differences in different trades and association professions, and then we need to be flexible. We mustn't be having a broad brush approach. Basically, the committee agrees that we can have legislation to stipulate that, generally speaking, employers and employees must have written employment contracts to stipulate the working hours, overtime work arrangements, and overtime work compensation methods. They are the main provisions, and they should also consider other ancillary provisions to further protect the employees in the grassroots sector that have a weaker bargaining power. And in fact, towards the end of last month, the committee also agreed that there should be further fine-tuning and there should be analysis of the data and consideration of the impacts. I want to emphasize that the committee hasn't finished the discussion, and it is expected to submit a report to the CE in the first quarter next year. We should allow them sufficient time and space to consider all the data in depth and comprehensively so as to arrive at a consensus. We need to respect their work so that they have time to have a comprehensive review of the data and information and then come up with the right position. For Mr. Ip Kin-yuen's proposal, indeed we have considered the differences in different professions, in particular education. And Mr. Yip is saying that we should follow the overseas practice, that is, we should stipulate the teaching hours of the teaching classes for the teachers. There was a special workshop for the teaching profession to listen to the views. I will refer Mr. Yip's views and other members' views to the relevant policy bureau and committees. Mr. Yiu Si-wing and Dr. N. Chang have said that the government should consult different trades, including the tourism industry, and we must assess the impact on the relevant trade and industry. And there should be in-depth discussion, and there should only be recommendations after a consensus. There were 40 such consultation briefings held last year, and then the tourism industry was covered, among other trades and industries. We have made reference to the findings of the consultation exercises and the working hours survey findings. We'll continue to assess the impact of different options on Hong Kong, and we'll listen to the views of the relevant societies. Working hours policy is very complicated and very controversial, but then we are not dragging our feet. The committee chairman and members have been working wholeheartedly. They have been very dedicated in planning and taking part in the work of the committee. I would like to thank them for their efforts, and I look forward to the rational and practical or pragmatic discussion of the employers and employees as well as the rest of the society. We should strive to respect each other, and we should be having mutual understanding so that we get the best direction that can protect the interests of the employees and allow us to continue with our economic development. Thank you.
Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan, you may now move your amendment. President, I move that Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be amended. I now propose the question to, and that is that the amendment moved by Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan be passed. And I'll put the question to as stated. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Those against? I think. Mr. Lee Cheuk-yan claims a division. The bell will ring for 5 minutes.
開始表決。
Voting begins.
請各位核對表決。
Members, please check your votes.
羅偉興議員，你是否？
Ms. Emily Lau, do you wish to vote? Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FC's 20 present, 7 yes, 12 noes, 1 abstention. Members from GC's 23 present, 12 yes, 10 noes. The question is not agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negative. Mr. Andrew Leung. President, I move that in the event of further divisions being claimed at this meeting in respect of the debate on enacting legislation on standard working hours, the Council shall proceed to the division after the bell has been rung for 1 minute. I propose the question to that is that the motion moved from Mr. Lam be passed. I now put the question to as stated. Those in favour, please raise their hands. Those against. I think the question is agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment passed. I order that in the event of further divisions being claimed at this meeting in respect of the motion on enacting legislation on standard working hours, the Council shall proceed to the division after the bell has rung for 1 minute. Mr. Ip Kin-yuen, you may now move your amendment. President, I move that Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be amended. And I propose the question to and that is the amendment moved by Mr. Ip Kin-yuen to Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be passed. I now put the question to you as stated. Will those in favour please raise their hands? Those against? I think the question. Mr. Andrew Leung claims a division. The bell will ring for 1 minute. Voting begins.
停止表決。
Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FC's 20 present, 7 yes, 10 noes, 3 abstentions. Members from GC's 23 present, 12 yes, 3 noes, 7 abstentions. The question is not agreed by majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negative. Mr. Yiu Si-wing, you may move your amendment. President, I move that Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be amended. I now propose the question to that is that the amendment moved by Mr. Yiu Si-wing to Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be passed. And I'll put the question to you as stated. Will those in favour please raise their hands? Those against? I think Mr. Cheung claims a division. The bell will ring for 1 minute.
開始表決。
Voting begins.
停止表決。
Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FCs 21 present, 6 yes, 12 noes, 3 abstentions. Members from GCs 23 present, 3 yes, 12 noes, 6 abstentions. The question is not agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negatived. Ms. N. Chang, you may move your amendment. President, I move that Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be amended. I now propose the question 2, and that is that the amendment moved by Ms. N. Chang be passed. I now put the question 2 as stated. Will those in favour please raise their hands? Those against? Mr. Lo Wai-kok claims a division. The bell will ring for 1 minute. Voting begins.
停止表決，顯示結果。
Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FCs 22 present, 8 yes, 8 noes, 6 abstentions. Members from GCs 23 present, 9 yes, 12 noes, 1 abstention. The question is not agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negatived. Mr. Leung Ka-lau, you may move your amendment. President, I move that Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be amended. And I propose the question 2, that is that the amendment moved by Mr. Leung Ka-lau to Ms. Chan Yuen-han's motion be passed. And I'll put the question 2 as stated. Will those in favour please raise their hands? Those against? Mr. Andrew Leung claims a division. The bell will ring for 1 minute. Voting begins.
停止表決。
Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FCs 22 present, 8 yes, 9 noes, 5 abstentions. Members from GCs 23 present, 13 yes, 3 noes, 6 abstentions. The question is not agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negatived. Ms. Chan Yuen-han, you may now reply, and you still have 7 minutes 42 seconds. Thank you. I want to read out one part from the manifesto of the CE. He sought the views of the FTU, and I said that during Donald's term, there was the proposal to bring together academics, employers, and employees to look at legislation on standard working hours, and there should be a joint study to promote the enactment of legislation on standard working hours. In fact, I wrote this part. And then there was a press release. And in that press release, nothing was mentioned about standard working hours. And then it said that the committee has come to 2 points of consensus. First of all, working hours should be laid down in writing. And then second, only those who are paid on a monthly basis can be covered. So we can see that the Standard Working Hours Committee is not acting in accordance with the promise laid down by the CE. The committee is inclined to let employers and employees sort out the matter themselves. And then the arrangement will be written down in the contracts. And then let's look at some figures. Last year, 1.07 million employees worked for over 44 hours a week. In other words, that's over 30% of the total working population. And for those working over 48 hours a week, and there were 90,000 more than the number in 2010. So you can see that employees are working very long hours. And then those working for over 68 hours a week, about 68,000 people, up 24,000. Those working over 72 hours a week, over 60,000. And the number has increased by 21,000. So these are figures provided by the government. So I really don't understand why the government can still adopt such an unsympathetic approach. You have to find solutions to this problem. So if you allow employers and employees to sort things out themselves, those who have been working for 48 hours a week will have to continue to work for 48 hours. Those who have been working for 72 hours a week will have to continue to work for 72 hours a week. We have very weak bargaining power. The capitalists are in a very strong position. We are in a very weak position. Now the professionals have a bigger bargaining power. And then the committee is of the view that only those earning less than $15,000 a month can be protected. This is not enough. There are many who are earning over $15,000 a month. They should also be covered. In fact, we have been fighting for standard working hours for many years. The government must not shirk its responsibility. I've read out the election manifesto of C.Y. Leung. He saw the problem in society, and that was why he agreed to include this part in the manifesto. He saw the difficulties faced by the employees. He also saw difficulties faced by elderly persons and the poor. So C.Y. Leung has done some work to alleviate poverty, but then he hasn't done anything to help the employees. Now, of course, the business sector do not want to see legislation on standard working hours. Hon Chan Yuen-han have been fighting for labor rights for over 30 years. I have heard their arguments many, many times. Look at countries where there is legislation on standard working hours. Have those economies collapsed? In fact, they are doing very well. I think employees also need quality life. They need time to spend with their families, to take care of their children. So I can agree with many members who have spoken. Employers are leading quality life. We employees are working very, very hard to make ends meet, to earn a living. Now, Members, I want to emphasize one point, and that is people say that Chan Yuen-han supported C.Y. Leung. In fact, at that time, Chan Yuen-han as well as many labor representatives voted for C.Y. Leung because he promised to look at legislation on standard working hours. Now, we're going to vote on the political reform package. So, do you think it's better to have 1,200 people voting to elect the CE, or is it better to have 5 million people taking part in the voting? Which model can help us protect labor interests better? So, if the CE is elected only by 1,200 people, then he may decide to formulate policies biased towards the business sector. But if he's elected 5 million people, then he will not choose to do that. So I think people should only work for 8 hours. Then there should be 8 hours for learning. And then 8 hours sleep. So I think that's why we should support the political reform package. You may think I'm digressing, but then we keep saying that C.Y. Leung has been bowing to pressure from the business sector. And that's because he was only elected by 1,200 people. In fact, he gave us a promise, but then when the 4 chambers of commerce gave him pressure, he backed down. And so if he can be, if the CE can be elected by a few million people, then he dares not side with the business sector. So the FTU supports standard working hours. We are against contractual working hours. Our position has never changed. This is really a very difficult situation. And I think for those who support the political reform package, do also take care of the interests of the employees. I now put a question to you, and that is that the motion moved by Ms. Chan Yuen-han be passed. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Mr. Frederick Chung claims a division. The bell will ring for 1 minute. Voting begins. Voting is closed. The results are displayed. Members from FCs, 21 present, 6 yes, 9 noes, 6 abstentions. Members from GCs, 25 present, 14 yes, 3 noes, 7 abstentions. The question is not agreed by a majority of each of the 2 groups of members present. I declare the motion negatived.
Debate on motion with no legislative effect.